Welcome back to Artificially Informed, the podcast series that offers an in-depth look at the Florida Attorney General's Government in the Sunshine Manual 2025 edition. I'm Joel Chandler, and as always, this episode is produced with the extensive use of artificial intelligence. I write the prompts and review and edit all of the output. In today's episode 18, we're continuing our in-depth exploration of Part 2, Public Records, specifically see what records are covered. Application of the Public Records, Act 2. We'll be navigating pages 148 through 163 of your manual. Our discussion will begin by finishing up the extensive list of personnel record exemptions related to personal information for public officers and employees, then move on to other personnel record categories like medical information, payroll, and undercover personnel. After that, we'll dive into security system information, social security numbers, telephone records, and finally, trade secrets and proprietary confidential business information. Given the extensive detail, this episode will be significantly longer than our usual 15 minutes. Let's pick up right where we left off with the long list of personnel record exemptions. Segment 1, C. What records are covered? Personnel records, personal information, Part 4, listing continued, pages 148 to 152. In our last episode, episode 17, we started on page 144 with N home addresses, telephone numbers, and other personal information, 18.N, and began going through the extensive 1 listing of public officers and employees covered by exemptions, 18.N.1. We covered categories up to impaired practitioner consultants. Now, continuing on page 148, let's finish this important list of public officers and employees whose personal identifying information is generally made confidential and exempt from public disclosure. This is because of the sensitive nature of their work, which can put them at risk for harassment or threats. First up, QQ Inspectors General and Internal Audit Personnel, 18.1Q, on page 148. These individuals are tasked with investigating potential misconduct, waste, or fraud within government agencies. Their work can expose them to retaliation, so their personal information is protected to ensure they can perform their duties without fear. Next, Room. Investigators and inspectors of the Department of Agriculture Consumer Services, 18.1R, also on page 148. These are folks who investigate consumer complaints, food safety, and agricultural issues. Their work often involves sensitive inspections and enforcement, so their personal data gets protection. Then, S investigators of the Department of Business and Professional Regulation, 18.1.1.S, also on page 148. These investigators look into complaints and potential violations by licensed professionals, from contractors to cosmetologists. The nature of their enforcement work justifies the confidentiality of their personal identifying information. Moving to page 149, we have T, investigators of the Department of Financial Services and Office of Financial Regulation, with specified duties, 18.N.1.T. These investigators handle financial crimes and regulatory compliance. Due to the high-stakes nature of financial investigations, their personal details are protected. Next on the list, U judges, magistrates, hearing officers, and judicial assistants, State, 18.1U, on page 149. These are individuals central to the judicial process. Protecting their personal information and that of their assistants is crucial for their safety and to prevent undue influence or harassment related to their official duties. Then, on page 150, V's juvenile justice, juvenile probation, and detention officers and counselors, 18.1.1.5. These professionals work directly with juvenile offenders, often in challenging environments, so their personal information is exempt to ensure their safety and the integrity of their work. Also on page 150, WBU Law Enforcement and Correctional Personnel, 18.11W. This is a broad category encompassing police officers, sheriff's deputies, correctional officers, and other related staff. Their personal identifying information, like home addresses and phone numbers, is generally confidential due to the inherent risk associated with their duties. Next, X. Military personnel, 18.1 extent on page 150. This applies to state military personnel and often includes National Guard members protecting their personal information for security reasons. Then, Y personnel of the Department of Health with specified duties, 18.1 year, also on page 150. This refers to Department of Health employees whose duties might involve sensitive public health investigations, disease control, or regulatory enforcement, warranting protection of their personal data. Moving to page 151, Z, prosecutors and judges, federal, 18.1Z. This category extends protection to federal prosecutors and judges who work within Florida, recognizing the sensitive and often high-risk nature of their roles. Next, AA, prosecutors, state, 18.11 AA, also on page 151. State attorneys and their staff who prosecute criminal cases also have their personal information protected due to the nature of their work. Then BB, public defenders and other specified counsel, 18.11 BB, also on page 151. Individuals providing legal defense in public roles also receive this protection. On page 152, CC, public guardians, 18.N1 CC. These individuals are appointed by the court to serve as guardians for vulnerable persons. Their personal information is protected due to the sensitive nature of their duties. Finally, DD, revenue collection and enforcement or child support enforcement, 18.1-1-DD, also on page 152. Personnel involved in collecting state revenue or enforcing child support orders often deal with contentious situations leading to the protection of their personal details. Segment 2, C, what records are covered? Personnel records, authority to release records held by non-employer agencies and application of exemption. Pages 152 to 155. Still under N, home addresses, telephone numbers, and other personal information, 18.N, we continue on page 152. First, 2. Authority to release protected information, 18.N.2, on page 152. Even though these personal details are generally confidential, there might be specific limited circumstances where the law allows for their release. This could be to other government agencies for official purposes, or if the individual themselves consents to the release. The key is that any release must be explicitly authorized by law. Next, on page 153, 3, records held by agencies that are not the employer of the designated officers or employees, 18.M.3. This is an important clarification. The confidentiality of these personal records doesn't just apply to the agency that employs the individual. If another public agency happens to possess this protected personal information, for example, a city clerk's office having a list of county tax collectors' home addresses, that agency also has the duty to keep that information confidential and apply the exemption. The protection follows the record, not just the employer. Finally, for this long personal information section on page 154, we have 4 application of exemption to 18.N.4. This clarifies some specific examples of what exactly is protected under this personal information exemption. A. Telephone numbers of cellular telephones issued by agencies, 18.N.4.A on page 154. Even if the cell phone is issued by the government, the employee's personal cell phone number used for agency business might be confidential. B. List of names of designated officers and employees, 18.N.4.B on page 154. The names themselves are generally public, but a list that specifically cross-references names with protected personal information, like home addresses, would be confidential. C. Prior home addresses, 18.N.4.C, on page 155. This means even old home addresses of these protected individuals are typically confidential, not just their current ones, to prevent historical tracking. D. Maps showing physical location of homes, 18.N.4.D on page 155. Any maps or diagrams that pinpoint the exact residential location of protected individuals are confidential. E. Home addresses of persons who are not the owner of the property, 18.N.4.E on page 155. This covers situations where the protected individual might be renting or living with someone else. Their residence address is still confidential. F. Booking photographs, 18.N.4.4.F on page 155. This refers to mugshots. While generally public, there are specific exemptions for the booking photographs of individuals who are themselves members of the protected classes, like a law enforcement officer who is arrested. Segment 3, C. What records are covered? Personnel records, medical info, payroll, retiree lists, salary and travel. Pages 155 to 157. Let's continue on page 155 with other types of personnel records. First, O medical information and health insurance participant information, 18.0. This category covers highly sensitive health-related data. 1. Medical information and medical claims records, 18.01 on page 155. Any medical information related to a public employee, including medical diagnoses, treatment records, and detailed claims, is generally confidential and exempt. This protection is vital for individual privacy and aligns with federal laws like HIPAA, Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. 2. Health insurance participant information, 18.0.2 on page 156. This refers to records that identify who is participating in a public agency's health insurance plan. While the cost of the plan to the agency might be public, the individual identities of participants are generally confidential to protect their medical privacy. Next, on page 156, we have P, payroll deduction records, 18.P. These records show specific deductions from an employee's paycheck, such as for health insurance, retirement contributions, or charitable donations. While an employee's gross and net pay are generally public, the detailed breakdown of these individual deductions is usually confidential and exempt, as it reveals personal financial information. Also on page 156, we cover Q, retiree lists, 18.Q. A list of public agency retirees, specifically their names and the amount of their retirement benefit, is typically public record. However, certain identifying personal information, like home addresses or specific contact details, may be confidential, similar to the protections for active employees. Moving to page 157, we find R salary records, 18.R, and this is a big one. Generally, the salary pay rates of a public employee is a public record. The public has a right to know how much taxpayer money is being spent on employee compensation. This includes basic salary, gross pay, and often benefits costs. While granular details like deductions might be confidential, the overall compensation figures are usually open. Next, S travel records, 18.5, also on page 157. Records detailing a public employee's travel expenses like mileage reimbursement, flight costs, hotel bills are generally public records. This ensures accountability for how public funds are spent on official travel. These include things like expense reports and receipts. Finally, for personnel records, T, undercover personnel of criminal justice agencies, 18.T, on page 157. This reinforces a point we've touched on. The identities of undercover law enforcement or criminal justice personnel are highly confidential and exempt. Their safety and effectiveness depend on their anonymity. This is a critical protection. Segment 4, C, what records are covered? Security system information, SSNS, telephone records, trade secrets, pages 157 to 163. Now let's shift to a new major category on page 157.19. Security system information and blueprints. These records are vital for public safety, but also inherently sensitive. First, A. Blueprints. 19A, on page 157, blueprints, diagrams, or schematics of public buildings, infrastructure like water plants, power stations, or emergency facilities are generally confidential and exempt. This is to prevent potential security vulnerabilities from being exploited by malicious actors. Knowing the layout of a building or a critical facility could assist in criminal or terrorist acts. Next, on page 158B, Security System Records 19.b. This refers to records specifically related to the design, installation, or operation of security systems. 1. Security system, alarm, permits and applications, 19.b.1. On page 158, these might include details about alarm systems installed in public buildings and the applications for permits to operate them. These can be confidential if they reveal security vulnerabilities. 2. Surveillance video recordings, 19.b.2. On page 158, video recordings from surveillance cameras in public places, like government buildings or parks, are generally public records. However, agencies can redact portions of these recordings that reveal confidential security techniques, the identity of undercover personnel, or sensitive personal information of individuals not related to the public purpose of the request, much like body camera footage. Moving to page 159C, Cybersecurity 19.c. Records related to an agency's cybersecurity measures, network vulnerabilities, or incident response plans are generally confidential and exempt. Disclosing this information could make government computer systems vulnerable to cyber attacks, jeopardizing sensitive data and public services. This is a growing area of vital confidentiality. Next, on page 160, we cover 20. Social Security numbers. This is a simple but absolute rule. Social Security numbers, or SSNs, are almost universally confidential and exempt from public records disclosure in Florida. This is a critical protection against identity theft. Agencies must redact SSNs from any public record before releasing it unless there is a specific legal requirement or explicit consent for disclosure. Also on page 161, we have 21. Telephone records. This refers to detailed telephone records such as call logs, phone numbers dialed, or location data associated with government phones. While the existence of a government phone might be public, the detailed usage records, particularly if they reveal personal calls or sensitive locations, are often confidential or at least subject to careful redaction to protect privacy and investigative methods. Finally, for this episode, on page 161, we introduce a major category, 22. Trade secrets and proprietary confidential business information. This protects sensitive commercial information held by public agencies. So first, A, trade secrets, 22A, on page 161. A trade secret is defined by law and involves information that derives independent economic value from not being generally known and is subject to reasonable efforts to maintain its secrecy. If a public agency holds a private company's trade secrets, for example, if a company submits its secret formula for a product in a bid, those trade secrets are generally confidential and exempt from public disclosure. This protects the company's competitive advantage. Next, on page 163B, proprietary confidential business information, 22.b. This is a broader category than trade secrets, but similarly protects commercially sensitive information. If a private entity submits information to a public agency that is generally considered proprietary or confidential business information, and its disclosure would cause harm to the business, it may be exempt. This often applies to details in bids, proposals, or financial statements submitted in competitive procurements. The purpose is to avoid disadvantaging companies that do business with the government by revealing their competitive data. This concludes our detailed exploration of various categories of personnel records, security-related records, and the important exemptions for Social Security numbers, telephone records, and trade secrets, proprietary information under C. What records are covered? Taking us through page 163 of your manual. Thanks for listening. In our next episode, episode 19, we'll continue exploring D, providing public records, where we'll delve into the validity of agency conditions on access, individual authorization, and the purpose of a request, taking us through page 178 of your manual. And until next time, remember, the truth dies in the dark, so let's leave the light on.